The silver shrimp fork was still cold in my right hand when I felt that familiar, creeping stillness. It is the exact kind of quiet you experience right before a tornado rips the siding off your house and scrambles your life. The grand ballroom at the hotel was all soaring marble columns, gilded mirrors, and velvet drapery. It was the precise sort of venue where fragile corporate egos wear expensive cufflinks and the dry white wine flows like sheer denial. I was sitting at table 9, positioned directly next to Lawrence Barlow, the chief executive officer of Pinnacle Global. Lawrence was a quiet titan in the shipping industry, a man whose casual handshake had once secured a $91 million logistics deal. My own suit was a standard charcoal gray, practical and clean, with a cut simple enough to signal that I was not there to impress anyone. I was there to make sure his massive regional warehouse network did not collapse under the heavy weight of corporate incompetence. Yet, somehow, looking around the room, I already knew this would be my last annual gala. You see, I was not anyone special by corporate title. I was just a senior operations liaison, which sounds about as exciting as a tax audit seminar in the middle of April. But my name was the one buried deep on page 58 of a 500-page logistics contract, listed under the essential continuity provisions. The corporate attorneys called it the Key Personnel Clause under the Federal Acquisition Regulation. Part 42. I called it my invisible ink, only noticeable when someone got arrogant enough to shine a bright light on it. Tonight, I was about to become that light. I had been with Hampton and Briggs for 18 years, long enough to know who refills the water pitchers in the executive boardroom and who routinely lies on their quarterly financial reports to hide the bleeding margins of their division. I had protected their back-end systems since the printer room still had a physical fax machine and people still made eye contact in the hallways. My daily work was not glamorous in the slightest, but it absolutely mattered to the survival of the enterprise. Every single Tuesday, I had standing calls with Pinnacle Global procurement managers. Every single Friday, I reviewed shipment redundancies like a careful surgeon spotting tiny tumors on an X-ray. Every month, I recalibrated performance benchmarks that saved millions of dollars and padded the fat bonuses of my former bosses like a luxury mattress. But no one in the current administration remembered that reality, especially not Julian Kincaid. Julian was new to the company. Julian was 40 years old. Julian wore Italian leather loafers without socks and called employees over 46 tribal knowledge assets, which is modern corporate code for people they would immediately fire if human resources had the stomach for the inevitable age discrimination lawsuits. He took one look at me and saw a 46-year-old salary line he could easily delete to hit his quarterly efficiency targets. He did not ask who wrote the service level agreements. He did not ask who brokered the original partnership with Pinnacle Global after their last contractor misrouted 400 tank batteries to a defunct facility. He just saw an older man who used bullet points instead of emojis and figured I was well past my software update. Julian was the kind of modern executive who prioritized empty optics over actual operations, treating foundational employees like outdated machinery instead of the load-bearing pillars of the entire firm. My wife, Helena, had warned me about executives like Julian years ago. She always said that raw arrogance blinds men to the structural integrity of the very bridges they walk on. I spent my days ensuring that the logistics framework between Hampton and Briggs and Pinnacle Global operated flawlessly, never dropping a single shipping container. I knew the regulatory environment better than our own legal team did. I understood that the Federal Acquisition Regulation dictated strict adherence to key personnel requirements. If a designated essential liaison was removed without the mutual consent of the client, it triggered an immediate material breach of contract. It was a fail-safe, a heavy anchor designed to prevent reckless corporate shuffling from destabilizing massive supply chains. But Julian Kincaid did not read contracts. He only read summary slides generated by his eager assistants. He loved buzzwords like synergy, aggressive streamlining, and paradigm shifts. The past few months had been a slow, agonizing bleed of institutional knowledge. The quiet campaign of my disappearance began subtly. First, it was Walter from accounting, a man who had caught more billing errors than any automated software ever could. One day, he simply was not there anymore, replaced by a junior analyst who did not know the difference between a tax credit and a liability. Then, Eleanor from Systems Integration was forcibly restructured into early retirement. My own digital permissions began vanishing one obscure database at a time. Human resources stopped responding to my emails with their usual promptness, replacing human replies with automated tickets that went nowhere. Even the Friday pastry order mysteriously shrank, cutting costs in the most demoralizing ways possible. It was the kind of psychological warfare you do not fully register until your security badge hesitates at the scanner, and nobody bothers to look you in the eye anymore. I had survived 4 different executive turnovers by staying essential, by holding the structural integrity of our most lucrative client relationship together with my bare hands. I was the silent engine in a loud machine, but Julian wanted a silent machine and a loud dashboard. He wanted to claim the $91 million logistics pipeline as his own victory, and to do that, he needed to scrub my fingerprints off the controls. He did not realize that my fingerprints were hard-coded into the legal framework of the deal itself. I was not just an employee, I was a contractual necessity, and he was about to learn that you cannot streamline a load-bearing wall without bringing the whole roof down on your own head. The vanishing act continued in the weeks leading up to the gala. It started with the weekly service level agreements reports I had reviewed every Friday since the previous administration was in the White House. I logged in one morning, hot coffee in hand, ready to cross-reference the shipment delays out of the Seattle port, and they were gone. Not moved to a new folder, not archived for compliance auditing, just completely gone. The screen flashed a red access denied error that felt like a digital slap in the face. I filed a support ticket with the Information Technology Department and received a templated reply within seconds. It read like it had been drafted by a soulless algorithm. It stated that access to these directories was now managed under a revised security protocol, and that I should consult my department lead for approval. The dark irony was that I was the department lead, or at least I had been for the last decade. That was the moment the reality of the situation crystallized. I opened the Pinnacle Global folder on my personal encrypted drive, not the one on the corporate cloud, but the one I had kept quietly updated on my home desktop, synced to a secure backup I never advertised to the Corporate Oversight Committee. I scrolled past years of correspondence, technical specifications, and addendums until I found the massive file, the contract, the beast. It was dated May 2007. It bore the signatures of 4 separate senior executives who had long since retired. It was a document written in legalese so dense you could use it to stop a bullet. I poured a second cup of dark roast coffee, pulled out a yellow highlighter, and flipped directly to page 58. There it was. Clause 21.8, heavily influenced by the Federal Acquisition Regulation, Part 42 regarding key personnel. The text was crystal clear, continuity of service provision. It stated that the following individuals are designated as essential personnel, and that removal from this project, whether through resignation or termination, shall constitute a material breach of agreement unless pre-approved by both parties or replaced through mutual written consent. And right beneath that imposing paragraph was my name, Gerald Vance, listed first in permanent ink. I stared at it for a long time, tracing the letters like it was a preemptive obituary for a career I had built from the ground up. The clause existed because of a massive operational scare we had endured back in 2006, when the old project manager vanished mid-project and left Pinnacle Global weeks away from a catastrophic shipping failure. After that disaster, their legal team insisted that anyone critical to the logistical flow had to be contractually cemented into the foundation of the agreement. Our legal department had eagerly added my name because, as the general counsel had told me at the time, I was the only one who actually held this entire logistical nightmare together. I printed the page, just that one specific page. I highlighted the clause in bright yellow, folded it once neatly, and slipped it into the leather briefcase I carried to every strategic meeting that Julian Kincaid deliberately omitted me from attending. A few days later, I noticed my internal dashboard login took a full minute longer to process, authenticating through restricted protocols. I saw that the monthly metrics review had been removed from my calendar invites. My manager, Julian, responded to my inquiries with that peculiar brand of corporate gaslighting designed to make you question your own sanity. He told me they were experimenting with a leaner reporting format this quarter, and that he appreciated my continued flexibility during this dynamic transition. I was not being paranoid. I was being systematically erased from the operational history of the company. The only problem was that no one had the courage to tell me what day they had actually scheduled my professional execution. So, I waited quietly in the shadows of my cubicle like a sharpened blade tucked securely behind a pane of breakable glass. Julian was already sharpening his metaphorical scissors, whistling a cheerful tune while he prepared to cut the cord. He called his initiative the Great Fat Cut during an all-hands meeting, flashing the same unnervingly white smile he used for his morning social media selfies. He told the gathered staff that we would be trimming redundancies to better align with agile scaling methodologies. Everyone who still possessed a physical desk simply smiled like frightened hostages and nodded in unison. Julian despised anything he deemed legacy. Legacy systems, legacy protocols, legacy employees. He spoke the word like it was a highly contagious virus, but what Julian loved more than anything was engagement metrics, meaningless status updates, and surprise one-on-one meetings that felt chillingly similar to pre-funeral consultations. I spent those final days wrapping up my loose ends meticulously. I documented every process, not for them, but for my own peace of mind. I wanted the record to show that until the very last second, Gerald Vance operated with absolute flawless precision. I reviewed the federal acquisition regulations, ensuring that Pinnacle Global would have immediate, incontrovertible grounds to claim a material breach the second my employment was severed without their express written consent. I was not plotting an active sabotage. I was simply preparing to let the laws of contractual physics take their natural, devastating course. I watched Julian strut through the office, high-fiving junior analysts and ignoring the seasoned veterans who actually kept the lights on. He was walking directly into a legal minefield, utterly blind to the tripwires wrapped tightly around his expensive Italian shoes. They say black tie events are where the most crucial corporate partnerships are sealed, but all I could feel that night was the slow, inevitable untethering of mine. The fabric of the formal tuxedo itched with a strange guilt, and my polished dress shoes pinched like impending deadlines. I walked into that aggressively decorated ballroom like a man deliberately stepping onto a slowly sinking ship. I smiled for the corporate event photographers, while knowing full well that the metaphorical lifeboats were strictly reserved for the young, the beautiful, and the blissfully blind. The atmosphere reeked of concentrated wealth and unspoken fear. Older executives paraded with much younger dates. The constant clink of $1,500 crystal stemware filled the air, and there was the soft, desperate murmur of people laughing far too loudly at jokes that were not funny. I had attended this specific industry gala 18 times over my career. I had personally helped design the seating arrangements for 9 of those years, but this time I was completely absent from any planning committee. No one had even bothered to send me the official dress code email. I only knew I was invited because Lawrence Barlow himself had texted me 2 weeks prior, asking if I was coming and making sure I was seated at his table. And there he was, Lawrence Barlow, Chief Executive Officer of Pinnacle Global. He leaned back in his plush dining chair like a man who had survived 3 separate hostile takeovers and still fundamentally distrusted times of peace. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo that likely cost more than my entire first car. He was sipping a 20-year-old single malt Scotch neat, projecting the calm detachment of a man who regularly reads government defense contracts for light entertainment. "Gerald," he nodded respectfully as I took my seat next to him. "You are the only reason we survived that 2009 European backlog fiasco. Do not think for a second I have forgotten that." He meant every single word. Lawrence was not the type of executive to waste praise on the undeserving. He handed out compliments like a black market commodity, rarely, surgically, and only to those who had definitively earned them in the trenches. "I am just glad we got you those high-capacity fuel cells in time to meet the quarterly quota," I replied, carefully unfolding my linen napkin. My voice remained steady, though my hands felt colder than the heavy silver cutlery resting beside my plate. Across the sprawling ballroom, Julian Kincaid held court with a half-circle of external consultants and junior executives. He was all blinding teeth and excessive hair gel, gesturing wildly like he was coaching a tech startup through a high-stakes television audition. Every now and then, someone at his cluster laughed entirely too loud. It was usually some poor, indebted intern or desperate director, eager to inhale the fumes from whatever hollow tech jargon Julian had memorized from a business magazine that morning. He never looked my way, not once. It was exactly like I had never existed, as if someone had already wiped my name off the organizational chart and was just waiting for the physical reality to catch up with the digital eraser. They had seated me just 2 chairs down from Lawrence, near a former state representative and a regional director from a massive aerospace firm. The conversation was all polite small talk and the rhythmic clinking of forks, but my mind was miles away. I was back at my desk, back in the quiet cubicle where Eleanor used to keep a jar of peppermints and Walter stuck cynical comic strips to the side of the heavy-duty printer. Back when the word team was not just an empty syllable Julian used before systematically eliminating half of one. The first course arrived. It was an intricate salad featuring baby arugula and whatever supposedly edible flowers the catering chefs like to pretend are worth $30 a plate. I picked at it mechanically. Lawrence talked animatedly about global supply chain, reforms, and overseas regulatory compliance. These were topics I usually loved diving into, but tonight they felt like a distant distraction, like humming a soft tune while sitting quietly in a burning building. "Your new vice president is here tonight," Lawrence said offhandedly, his sharp eyes drifting casually toward Julian's loud gathering. "Yes, he is," I replied, my tone as dry as neglected drywall. "He is certainly very enthusiastic about the new direction." "Enthusiastic is definitely one word for it," Lawrence noted, raising a single highly skeptical eyebrow. I offered a tight, non-committal smile. He did not press the issue. Men like Lawrence did not need to press. They had seen corporate house-cleaning operations too many times. They knew precisely what it looked like when a veteran was being quietly phased out for a cheaper, younger replacement. But there was something distinct in the way Lawrence looked at me, measured, intensely curious, like a seasoned engineer checking for fatal structural cracks in a dam he previously thought was completely indestructible. The night dragged on in polite, sparkling misery. I answered industry questions, passed the artisan roles, made the required eye contact, and laughed exactly when social convention demanded. And all the while, Julian never looked over. Not a single nod, not a passing glance, not even an accidental gaze that might signal a basic recognition of my existence. But my phone suddenly buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a message from Julian. The text was blunt. "Gerald, we are finalizing the operational structure for next quarter. Your role has been eliminated, effective immediately. Please do not report to the office on Monday. A severance package will be mailed to your home." I stared at the screen, then quietly showed the message to Lawrence, sitting next to me. Lawrence read it, his face hardening. He pulled out his own phone and sent a message straight to Julian. "I believe you just terminated our master service agreement as well. See you in court." The moment Lawrence Barlow pressed send, a new and profoundly heavy silence was born at our table. It was not the awkward kind of silence that follows a bad joke, nor the ceremonial hush before a keynote speech. It was a silence filled with immense gravity, thick with the weight of immediate, catastrophic consequences. Somewhere across the expansive, echoing ballroom, Julian Kincaid's phone buzzed in his tailored tuxedo jacket. He did not check it right away. He was entirely too busy laughing at his own exaggerated anecdote. Completely surrounded by sycophants who had absolutely no idea that the financial floor had just violently fallen out from underneath them all. Lawrence Barlow simply turned back to his plate as if absolutely nothing of consequence had just occurred. He took another measured sip of his expensive bourbon and picked up his silver fork to continue his meal. I went back to eating my rubbery veal. There was no panic inside me, no boiling rage, just a freezing, absolute sense of completion. It felt exactly like watching a heavy ballistic missile finally leave the underground silo after years of waiting patiently in the dark. This was not a petty act of vengeance. This was a strict adherence to contractual protocol. Julian firmly believed he was aggressively streamlining the department to boost his quarterly metrics. What he actually did was blindly step on a legally binding landmine crafted by meticulous lawyers who understood that operational continuity was not a mere corporate buzzword. It was a fundamental pillar of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, Part 42. He had just unilaterally violated a key personnel requirement on a federally regulated supply chain contract. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to argue my value to the firm. Julian's boundless arrogance had loaded the weapon and fired it. All I did was quietly ensure that the barrel was pointed directly at the correct legal clause. Around the vast room, hundreds of people kept chatting, raising their glasses for endless toasts and cutting into their overpriced proteins. But I could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the sudden drop in barometric pressure right before a massive thunderstorm. Finally, Julian reached into his pocket and looked at his glowing screen. His face did not immediately crack, not yet, but his perfectly groomed brow furrowed deeply, and a visible tic developed in his tightened jaw. He abruptly stepped away from his circle of admirers, moving swiftly toward the quiet lobby. He walked completely without his usual swagger, looking like a man who had just realized his parachute was packed with old newspapers. Lawrence smiled warmly at the approaching dessert cart. "They are serving crème brûlée tonight," he noted casually, as if we were merely discussing the weather forecast. "They always manage to burn it," I replied, maintaining the same conversational tone. Lawrence's grin widened, revealing a flash of genuine amusement. "That is definitely not the only thing getting torched tonight, Gerald." The crème brûlée was indeed slightly burned. Of course it was, but I ate every single bite as if I were spooning pure, unadulterated justice out of a sugar-crusted porcelain dish. Julian never returned to his seat for the remainder of the evening. His empty chair sat there at his table like a glaring question mark that no one dared to answer. His cloth napkin remained hastily tossed on the table, his expensive wine completely untouched. The rest of the lavish gala played out like a dedicated string quartet, stubbornly playing on the deck of the sinking Titanic. Attentive waiters poured endless cups of decaffeinated coffee. Countless toasts clinked in the air. Tedious speeches dragged on far past their allotted time. But underneath the facade of celebration, you could feel the violent ripple tearing beneath the expensive tablecloths. Something's massive had gone off in the background. No one said a word aloud, but nervous glances started darting across the room like startled fish in extremely shallow water. A frantic executive in public relations whispered entirely too loudly into the ear of the chief financial officer. Cell phones belonging to upper management began vibrating with alarming frequency. And me? I simply sat there like a calm observer at my own professional wake, completely composed and entirely at peace. When the evening's industry awards were announced, I clapped politely and appropriately. When they flashed Julian's name on the giant projector screen as a key donor, I took a slow sip of my lukewarm coffee and smiled just slightly. I knew for a fact that Pinnacle Global's relentless legal team did not need a calendar invite to start moving. Those corporate attorneys were ex-Department of Defense litigators, and they still treated weekends like active combat zones. By Saturday morning, Pinnacle's lawyers were already mercilessly digging through archived emails, past contract amendments, recorded call logs, change requests, and strict renewal terms. By Sunday evening, an anonymous contact in our finance department sent me a frantic screenshot of an internal message board. The message simply read, "Who in God's name approved removing the clause holder?" No one had replied to the thread. The digital silence was deafening. Monday morning arrived with the harsh, cruel clarity of a severe hangover. I showed up to the corporate office at exactly 8:29. I was sharp as always. By lunchtime on Monday, panicked whispers were leaking uncontrollably from Pinnacle Global's vendor relations team. The termination of my employment had been officially flagged by their internal compliance division. An emergency email chain surfaced, showing that Julian Kincaid had made unilateral, aggressive staffing changes without ever consulting the legal department, explicitly violating the Federal Acquisition Regulation terms of engagement for a Tier 1 government contractor. I did not need to lift a single finger to defend myself. All I had to do was step back and not interrupt the massive legal machine while it slowly chewed through him. That afternoon, my corporate email inbox was permanently locked. My internal messaging profile blinked inactive. My name was hastily scrubbed from the weekly logistics meeting roster. But the fascinating thing about trying to erase a designated key personnel name is that sometimes that specific name is the exact key that unlocks catastrophic financial consequences. I was not just gone, I was a detonated explosive. By early Tuesday morning, Hampton and Briggs' panicked lawyers had already entered the very first stage of corporate grief, absolute denial served with a heavy side of white-knuckled terror. They desperately sent a drafted memo to Pinnacle Global claiming the clause in question, Clause 21.8, continuity of service provision, was merely contextual and entirely non-binding under the newly restructured scope of vendor relationships. They even had the sheer audacity to legally suggest the specific wording was fundamentally outdated, referencing personnel who were allegedly no longer central to daily operational workflows. But here was the undeniable kicker. My name was not just casually scribbled in the margins of a draft. It was etched into the final document, heavily bolded, complete with a verified digital timestamp and the authorizing initials from 4 separate senior executives, including the now retired general counsel, who used to openly call me the only actual adult in the entire damn building. And unlike most of the modern contracts that Julian merely skimmed while walking on his expensive standing desk treadmill, this specific agreement had never been amended, not once, not a single time in 18 years. Pinnacle Global's official legal reply was brutally swift. It consisted of exactly one sentence, 14 devastating words. Your firm has committed a material breach of contract terms. Formal demand for damages incoming. By noon that same day, the massive lawsuit was officially filed in federal court. It was not merely threatened, it was filed and stamped. The sheer number hit the executive suite like a tactical bomb. $38 million in immediate projected losses, crippling government regulatory penalties, and potential cascading delays in 5 critical military supply chains entirely due to the severed operational continuity. But it was not just the astronomical dollar sign that broke the firm's spirit. It was the undeniable fact that the breach was so stupidly, easily preventable, and so embarrassingly reckless that the public relations department could not even figure out how to spin it. The firm's current general counsel reportedly slammed a 3-inch binder across a mahogany conference table and screamed, "You fired the federally mandated clause holder." He looked like he had just found out someone accidentally donated the entire company credit line to a fraudulent charity. Intensive internal audits began within hours of the filing. Human resources logs were aggressively pulled. Thousands of email trails were forensically scrubbed. Messaging channels were immediately locked to read-only status. Everyone was desperately digging for someone, any executive who could claim they had officially signed off on my termination. They did not find anyone because there was absolutely no one to find. Julian, in all of his sockless, arrogant glory, had acted completely unilaterally. There was no legal review, no executive leadership sign-off, no fundamental due diligence, just pure unchecked hubris. He tried to pull rank, of course. He sent a frantic all-hands email claiming the key personnel clause had simply aged out, and that he was fully empowered to make strategic personnel decisions in direct alignment with aggressive post-pandemic restructuring goals. But human resources was not buying his excuses. Legal was not buying it. And the furious board of directors, they were not just rejecting his narrative. They were actively sharpening their sacrificial knives. A week later, a highly confidential internal email was leaked to the press. It had exactly 4 words in the subject line. Who approved firing Gerald? The entire thread below it had absolutely 0 replies. It was just an echoing chain of terrified executives quietly choking on their own catastrophic omission. And where was I during this meltdown? I was sitting comfortably on my back porch, a hot cup of dark roast coffee in my hand, peacefully watching the neighborhood squirrels attempt to decimate my newly installed bird feeder. I did not gloat to former colleagues. I did not post triumphant messages online. I just let the warm morning sun soak into my tired knees while Pinnacle Global's ruthless legal team calmly and systematically dismantled every pathetic excuse Hampton and Briggs tossed their way. By Friday afternoon, the firm's stock value plummeted by a staggering 21%. By the following Monday, their second biggest West Coast client formally canceled a massive contract renewal, citing severe instability in executive leadership. Julian completely stopped posting on his social media profiles. The board of directors terminated Julian Kincaid for cause, stripping him of all stock options and severance. To settle the massive lawsuit, Hampton and Briggs reached out to me with a formal apology and an offer to return. They offered me the role of Vice President of Global Logistics Operations, with a base salary of $300,000, a signing bonus of $50,000, and 5 weeks of paid vacation. Furthermore, at my insistence, they reinstated Walter in accounting and Eleanor in systems integration, restoring their original tenures and salaries. The lawsuit was settled out of court, and Pinnacle Global signed a new agreement with us, with my name once again permanently written into the contract. On a warm Saturday evening, Helena and I hosted a small celebratory dinner in our garden, raising our glasses of red wine to the future. I was no longer just a name buried on page 58. I was the leader of the entire division, and my team was finally secure.